A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Oxford University Press, I would like to welcome you all to a lecture on the ethics and economics of climate change policy. To begin with, I'd like to request Professor Shrikant Gupta, Associate Professor at Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, to welcome Professor Charles Kostad and take the evening forward. Over to you, sir.
The floor is open. We would invite questions. I saw Professor Aparna Sahni from JNU, who's also worked on climate change, had her hands up. So Aparna, you have the floor.
Okay, just a quick question following what you had mentioned, Nevros. You had said that when looking at a solution, taking in responsibility for the future and trying to hit a balance, how countries like India would be looking at co-benefits. And obviously, if you're trying to look for a solution, there have to be some countries who take on absolute caps on emissions. So when one thinks of mechanisms which have been used, and we have seen this most recently in the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, and the UNFCCC had actually pushed for it and recommended it. So how different would that be? So I know you're not making policy prescriptions, but are you actually looking at trying to find some reform of that CDM, because that in itself ran into a lot of problems of questions of additionality and so on, right? So.
Any other interventions? If you could please identify yourself, that would be very nice.
Okay, my name is Sachindra, and I'm a student at Terry University. I'm doing my master's currently. So I have another question regarding co-benefits. That's, you mentioned a point saying that focusing on co-benefits will actually lead to taking the focus away on absolute limits for different countries. So could you probably explain a bit more as to how would that result in that scenario? Yeah, that's my question.
Maybe I'll collect one more question. I'll collect one more question and then, yes, sir. Could you please identify yourself? Yes.
My name is Dieter Mutz from GIZ, German Development Corporation. I have two questions, if you allow me, but they're somehow interrelated. If you look at the per capita emission in India, it's very low, but when you look who is emitting, if you are looking who is emitting, maybe you have 10%, 20% who really are emitting, and you have 500 million who do not more or less at all emit. And does not India make a mistake saying, in order of justice, in order of responsibility, we feel we have the right to emit, although the benefit really goes to the rich, to make rich richer and to keep the poor people poor. And the question is I have in this context, because I made very often the example that we are not in India efficient with the electricity consumption and so on. Wouldn't it be better to have some targets, to have some benchmarks in order to put more pressure on efficiency in terms of energy consumption, in terms of material consumption in India?
Let me comment on the question that was actually directed at Nevros, which is an intriguing concept that there's some countries that need absolute limits and other countries that will pursue actions that are justified on the basis of co-benefits, perhaps in addition to greenhouse benefits. That's a little unclear. I don't think that we always need to think in terms of absolute limits on anything. There is, so far, nobody's found a red line over which we can't step. You know, if you're talking about ingesting poisonous substances into your body, there's a red line where you die. And if you don't die, you're okay. You get better. I mean, more or less. So that, you know, there's some things that really do have this threshold effect, but climate change doesn't seem to be one of them. You know, today it was what was it, 40 degrees out there. 45 is worse. 46 is worse than that. 50 is worse than that. But you know, is there some temperature that we absolutely have to avoid? Well, maybe 100 degrees we need to avoid, but it's a question of more is worse in the case of climate change and less is better. So it could be that some countries, maybe a way of rephrasing it is that some countries should really take strong efforts to reduce emissions simply based on a calculation of emissions, whereas other countries should take a broader perspective on justifying cutbacks, integrating co-benefits into the analysis.
So, Navroz, you had a lot of, your thoughts drew a lot of comments, so yes.
No, thank you, Shrikant. I maybe just particularly focus on the two questions around co-benefits, which I think is a very intriguing concept. Aparna's question, the idea of co-benefits is very different from CDM. I should just say, incidentally, I'm not a fan of CDM at all, for all kinds of reasons. The key distinction is that the co-benefit story is really about countries doing something with their own money in terms of domestic policy. So it doesn't require all the kinds of baseline problems that you had with CDM and the fact that you might have taken a certain measure anyway without it having been paid for by somebody else. So it's quite a different set of issues, and the challenge is less the project-by-project accounting challenge of CDM and more the broad policy challenge of how you mainstream climate change and how you actually mediate different objectives. How do you look at, say, energy security, climate mitigation, local air pollution, local distributive consequences, to get back to the other questioner. How do you trade off between all of those things? How do you make that explicit? And I'm happy to sort of talk later about some sort of ideas I've put out in the public domain about this. But it's a very different and I think a much more interesting challenge than the CDM challenge, which basically boiled down to being an accounting challenge in the face of things that were impossible to know, sort of counterfactual baselines that were hugely problematic. The other question about the co-benefits and absolute limits, here I guess I would somewhat take a slightly different approach to Charlie. I actually think that, yes, in a sense with climate mitigation, more is better, but the IPCC report of 2007, AR4, actually tried to give us a band. And it said, look, with 450 parts per million concentration, you have a 50 to 80% risk of going beyond 2.5 degrees, and that would be a really bad thing in our view. So that's sort of a benchmark range for the policy process to worry about. And then you can back off from that 450 concentration number and say, well, in that case, what do you have to do as a global community? And then other people have said, all right, that actually translates to 1440 gigatons of CO2 as a carbon budget from 2000 to 2050. So you actually have a number to work with. Now, that number has actually got a lot of salience. In order to reach that number, you need to have some predictability about emissions. And if you want to have that predictability about emissions, if every country says, we will go down this co-benefits track, it's very hard to get some predictability and to have some sense of the burden sharing of responsibility across different countries. So I actually think that for this to be tenable, for an approach to be tenable, there have to be some countries that really are willing to say, all right, we know we are not going to go above this, and we have a pretty good shot of reducing at this rate. And that then gives other countries that are in a different stage of development, really. I mean, India is going through sort of a demographic transition, an urbanization transition, a transition to a manufacturing and services economy, all at the same time. It's very hard to predict emissions in India. And I think that's one way in which we can recast the idea of differentiation. So differentiation circa 1992 was industrialized countries take on commitments, developing countries just kind of do what they were always doing. That's, in my view, not tenable anymore. But what is tenable is a view that says, look, developing countries like India make good faith efforts that are good faith in a way we all agree is good faith, not just as we decide, while industrialized countries actually do take on some absolute targets, which has already, in a sense, and that's not disputed anymore. I mean, that's what the Kyoto Protocol agreed to. That shouldn't be controversial anymore. So just if I can have a quick second on the intra-country equity point, I think it's very important. I think India loses a lot of credibility when we talk about equity overseas without talking about equity at home. At the same time, if we talk about equity at home and we look at the numbers, there is this very sort of creamy layer of India that builds, 27-story buildings for individual families and so on. But if you add up that sort of really egregious consumption level, it doesn't amount to very much in terms of the total proportion of Indians. If you look at the Indians that are consuming at the level of, say, above the US poverty line, the numbers are very hard to come by, but you would be hard-pressed to find more than 20, 30 million Indians above $16 a day PPP, which is the US poverty line. So in terms of global consumption standards, we're like a medium to large European country. It's not going to solve the problem if Indian elite actually subject themselves to the same kinds of controls we're asking the industrialized countries to. I think we should, but it won't solve the problem.
So, yes, sir.
Can I? Okay, my name is Piyush. I am from IIT Delhi. And my question is regarding the concept of co-benefits, which Dr. Navroz pointed at. So India is making this promise of co-benefits. And what I find is conspicuously missing from this discourse is the role of technology. Because the promise of co-benefits is easier said than done. Well, it sounds great in theory, as in solving developmental challenges and environmental challenges as well. But I think what makes India's commitment for co-benefits very less credible is this whole debate about green technology, which is central to how we achieve co-benefits, is missing from our political discourse.
I'd like to probably make this the last question with the gentleman here, if there is nobody else who would like to ask, and then we will have Professor Kostad, and maybe I'll say a couple of things. Yes.
Hello, I'm Sushil and I'm a master's student at Delhi University. So one point I would like to make is since from 1992 or since 90, we have still been there's a debate over developed countries and developing countries. One thing we have forgot is climate change is indifferent towards the historical actions or the developmental justice as we speak. So as Dr. Navroz pointed out regarding the co-benefit, how different is it again from the CBDR? Developing countries goes towards the co-benefits, as the developed countries goes towards an absolute limit. Again, we will come to the same point of sharing responsibilities, which won't come to a consensus. Again, we won't come to a consensus. So at this point of time, again, there will be a political discourse at an international arena, and we won't come to a consensus or have an action plan for the future.
Okay, I have another question for Professor Kostad. We've been talking a lot about how ethics play a role as far as climate change policy is concerned and how justice should be served. But there's been no discussion about who gets to decide, or rather there's no governing body that says that, okay, this is the justice that needs to be served at a global level. I mean, you see a lot of fragmented approach for mitigating climate change around the world, but there's no unified body that says that overpowers every other government. So is it because of the fundamental governing principles of the current economic system, or can we foresee a body like this being formed sometime in the future?
I think we will have another roundtable on that, and people like Navroz are experts on global governance. But what I would like to do with Charlie's permission is I'll just say a couple of things, and we'll leave you the honor of having the last word, if that's okay with you.
If there's anything to talk about.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to think about I think Navroz has answered the question about the inequity within the country, and I think that's important. So nobody denies that there is inequity in terms of emissions. And the late Anil Agarwal, the famous environmentalist, talked about luxury emissions versus survival emissions. And so I think we are seized of the problem, whether practically it makes a difference or not. Yes, I think morally emissions at that level are not justifiable.
Let me just add to this question on India being divided into the rich and the poor. I think Navroz is right about India as a case in point, but it's an issue that goes a little deeper than that. China, for instance, has a bigger, wealthier class, and as both countries develop, it is a very interesting point that there's a segment of the population that's a first world population, or it will be anyway, and then a segment that's really poor. And I'm not sure how that should play out. It's a very intriguing issue. We tend to put countries, average them together, but they're heterogeneous. So, but on the last points let me make are, first of all, the point about there being a 2.5 degree limit. The IPCC may have said that things will be bad after 2.5 degrees, but the fact is that there's very little evidence of where that line should be. If you look at the impacts, there's no sense that there's a point at which things get really bad. The politicians in Copenhagen did pull 2 degrees out of their back pockets as a good limit to use. But it's a political decision, not based on the scientific evidence. Perhaps it is 2 degrees rather, or 2.5, but the evidence that that's the limit is not there. And that has implications for the approach one takes to regulating the problem. But let me end on a note to address the question raised. Actually, I forgot who raised it, but how ethics plays a role. Who decides? Where's the decision maker, the decider? And I think the answer to that is there is nobody that decides those questions. But we're going to need eventually an agreement among at least the major countries to do something about this problem. And that's where all of these issues will come together. Fairness, what's equitable, what's effective, all of those issues will need to be addressed to the satisfaction of all the signatories to an agreement. And that's where we'll get the enforcement of this coming from. With that, because there won't be anybody standing at a higher level than India or any other country telling them what they should do, but it'll emerge from a mutual decision of all the countries of the world. When that'll happen, maybe one of the other panelists will tell us that. Thank you.